Good evening. We are continuing our study in 1 Timothy chapter 5 this evening. And last time we were together, we were trying to go through the material and we had some discussion about a few things. And so I'll kind of want to circle back over a few of those things and then we can kind of open it up for some further discussion. As we go back to the text, you see in 1 Timothy chapter 5, speaking of how you treat individuals and specifically how you would show respect and disrespect in the first few verses. Then there is the honoring the widows that are widows indeed. Now, you can't see the board. You do have an opportunity to move closer if you'd like. It would have been hard for me to write too much bigger, and the board is not real huge, so if you want to be able to read that, then you can scoot closer. But if not, you don't have to see the board because I'll kindly read most of it to you. And I have this handy-dandy, I had forgotten about this until the lectureship, and Mike McDaniel, I think, was the one that knocked it off and it rolled on the floor. And then it sat down there and I thought, I had forgotten about that handy-dandy stick that's attached to the pulpit. It's back up there, they got a little clip. And so I thought I would use that tonight as a pointer. So the first thing, I'm going to put several things up here that are just definitions to kind of identify our terms and what we're talking about that will help us to identify what widows indeed are, who are those that are enrolled widows. And so the first thing that is listed is the word widow, and it gives the reference numbers, but ultimately the word is taken down from the root that is a gap, a gulf, chasm, or a wide space. And if you look at Strong's definition of that word, that is the root for widow, it is a chasm or vacancy. And that is the idea of deficiency, which we would get lacking a husband. There is the deficiency of having that spouse, and so that's where we get widow, and that's the root of the word. And then there is the word indeed, from widow indeed. And that is an adverb. It means really, truly, or actually. A lot of times when we look at it, we're thinking of someone that has no means, that is impoverished. And you'll get that more from the context than you will from the definition of the word itself. The context will demand that, but the word itself does not actually, it's not defined that way. It just means a real one. So when it says widow indeed, we're talking about somebody that is actually a widow. Truly, actually, really. And there's a couple of places that this word is used, and it's used in 1 Corinthians 14:25, and it says of a truth, and that's how that word is translated. And in Luke chapter 24 and verse 34, it says risen indeed. And so those are two places where you can kind of see different translations that are given in our English New Testaments and the King James for that particular word. And so we're saying this is a widow, truly a widow, and then that's the reference that is there. Then we'll notice in our text, it talks about in verse 5 of 1 Timothy chapter 5, it says, now she that is a widow indeed and desolate. So the word desolate helps define even further. You have widows that are widows indeed, but some of them have family members. And so the Bible says those family members need to take care of the widows that are widows indeed. And then there are some that are widows indeed that are desolate. And those individuals can be assisted and should be helped, should be honored. And so here in this you have desolate, and really it comes, you can see the word that is here. We use mono and stereo, and you can see where we get mono as it comes from this word, which is desolate. We would say that's alone. You got one channel, two channels on your headset. If it's mono, it's only coming through one. And so that's the word to leave alone, forsake, or solitary. And it is to make single or solitary, to leave alone. And then Thayer's, in the midst of defining other things, it mentions without children. So not only alone from the standpoint of not having that spouse, but also when it mentions desolate, we're talking about those that don't have those children. So that's the contrast to the verse that precedes it in verse 4, which says, here's a widow who has needs, and there's family that can take care of that and must take care of that. That's the role of family. And that is the call for Christians here to provide for those needs. But then it says, now then there's a widow that is a widow, truly a widow, and she's desolate, which means she is alone. Not only does she not have her spouse, but she also doesn't have a family that can step in and take care. And then it describes a contrast between maybe you have a widow that has no family and is alone, and then there's one that's moral and one that's not moral. And that's the contrast that takes place in verse 5 and then in verse 6. So you have one that certainly should be taken care of and helped and supported. You've got one that has faith in God, that trusts in God, that prays to God, relies upon God. On the other hand, you have one who actually may be in that situation, who is desolate, but is living up in pleasures, and the Bible says she's dead while she yet liveth. And so, it is interesting. It seems to me, as I was reading down through this, verse 5 and 6, that you have even a contrast potentially in verse 6 of someone who was a Christian but no longer is. But I'm not sure exactly on that, but it appears that potentially could be the case. So we continue to move on. Then you have enrolled, and enrolled just means taken in the number, put on the list. And there's different translations that use that word that is found on down in the text. And I believe that is verse 9 of this passage. Let not a widow be taken into the number. So you have the King James taken into the number. I think it's New American Standard says put on the list. Other translations use the word enrolled. And you can see katalego, which is where we get our word catalog. So when we're talking about we're cataloging those widows, then that's the principle or the idea. We're putting them on a list. At least that's where it comes from, and you can kind of see that as it would be brought out in our language. Then jumping down to verse 12, and we'll come back and hit this again. I'm just going to go over the information that I have up here. So he talks about those widows that are to be taken into the number, enrolled, put on the list, they're cataloged, and it gives qualifications for those, but then it speaks of those that are younger, and they are to be rejected. And in the midst of this, in the translation here, in verse 12, he tells them that they're rejected, and then the reason in verse 11, when they begin to have a sexual appetite, we would say, then they're going to marry. And that's appropriate according to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, which is what that teaches there in the first few verses of 1 Corinthians 7. But then in verse 12, the King James says, having damnation because they have cast off their first faith. And which ultimately we're talking about they are going to incur judgment because the first faith they have cast off. But the American Standard Version says, having condemnation because they have rejected their first pledge. So last time we were together, I used the word vow, which is, in correlation, it would be a synonym for the word pledge. And that's actually derived from the American Standard Version in the translation of verse 12. It says that they have condemnation because they have rejected their first pledge. And the word here, faith, is that the word that is used there, faith is an appropriate translation as well, because most of the time that word, that's how it's translated. We do also notice, though, if you look down in some of the definitions that are given in Thayer's Greek lexicon of the word that's used for faith or pledge found in verse 12. It's number 2. He defines that as fidelity or faithfulness, the character of one who can be relied upon, of one who keeps his promises. And so that's why in the American Standard Translation they use the word pledge instead of the word faith, because that is one of the derivatives that is used of that particular word, or a way that it can be used. And so you can kind of see that. So there are challenging questions when you move through this text. And most people probably don't realize they're rolling through this text, that there are some challenges or some difficulties when you try to get in there and try to figure out exactly what is being stated, or figuring out exactly how to apply this. And so I want to read just a brief article. And the reason I do this is because this is probably, I've been looking at a lot of different resources, and this is one of the best to draw out one by one as you move through this text in 1 Timothy chapter 5, and then to try to ask questions based upon which thing to be considering when you're looking at application. So here at the beginning, and this starts off saying the meaning of honor. So then you're trying to figure out from 1 Timothy chapter 5, what is the meaning of honor? From verse 3, 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 3. Give proper honor to those widows who are really in need. And then the question is, does to honor imply interpersonal respect, financial support? Does it imply both? Are we just to respect widows from verse 3? Or are we to financially support them? Or does it include both of those things? Is this a parallel to granting double honor to elders that is found in verse 17, which certainly would carry the financial support because of the context there. Another thing that is mentioned from verse 5 and 6 is the placement of need and then the pleasure contrast. The widow who is really in need and left all alone puts her hope in God and continues night and day to pray and to ask God for help. But the widow who lives for pleasure is dead even while she lives. Is the reference to need or praying a Pauline tangent, further description of real widow, or a prerequisite for enrollment? And of course, this is what some people are going back and forth. Does this have to do with the enrolled or does it not? And that's a question that is asked. Then you go down and look at verse 9, and then it says the meaning of to enroll. And then you can read the passage and all of the things that are given there. Did Paul simply describe a name being added to a charity list? Or is he implying accompanying duties for the person placed on the list? If the former, do we refuse food to hungry older women who have not done these things? The description parallels in many ways the description even found as referenced over in the description in chapter 3, verses 2 through 7, regarding faithfulness to a spouse in that section. Then it says, meaning of faithful to your husband, and it mentions a few things there. Was Paul referring to a woman who was married once only, or is the emphasis on being a one-man kind of woman? Basically, does it mean that she could only be married once? Like if she's put away her spouse, and then she's married another, and then that spouse dies, can that person fulfill these qualifications that are listed here, or does that actually have to do with faithfulness and fidelity to the marital vows when they were in the relationship that they were in? So that's a question that is asked. Then there is a list of qualifications and duties found in verse 10. So if you're looking at verse 10, here it lists those qualifications. Does this list describe the past character of the widow in view, or was Paul outlining ongoing responsibilities of an enrolled widow? Because that's what sometimes the commentators will come back to. They will say, well, she's made this pledge, she's made an agreement that she's not going to marry again and that she's going to give herself full time in service to fulfill some special service or role, and that they would then go to this passage to say this is the kind of work that this woman would be doing. This is the type of service that would be carried out. Then you have the meaning of a widow who is really a widow from verses 3, verse 5, and verse 16. What is the difference between a widow and an actual or real widow? Which kind of seems funny to me, because that's exactly what indeed means. What is the difference between a widow and one that's a real widow, an actual widow? These are questions that you ask when you're going through the text because you're trying to figure that out. Is this in reference to her lack of family members, her devotion to God, the characteristics listed in verses 3 through 10, all of the above? What does this have to do with? A few people roughly contemporary with Paul speak of, we'll say some early writers, we'll say some of the early church fathers, speak of widows who are virgins, suggesting the word was used to mean a without a man woman. So are the widows and then actual widows. So that you'd have widows and then those that are actually widows. And if so, did one include an older single woman who never married versus those that are bereft of their husbands? And that's actually a really interesting question. What about an older woman who never married, didn't have family? No family, so she has no children. Depends on what you mean by enrolled. See, widow that is a widow indeed can be supported by the church. So if there's a difference between a widow indeed and the one that is added to a list and enrolled, it would be different. For example, are we saying that if Pearl Bird, I'll use her for an example, who's been married and have children, and if she didn't have any family to take care of her, could the church not help her? Could the church not take care of her needs? Then you're making it real serious now. That's a real life application to the congregation here. So it's a question. But let me roll through these and I'll get back to you. But that's again, these are just questions that are brought up. Some people would say, well, the context doesn't really deal with that situation. It's not talking about that. And well, not based upon some that say who is a widow versus a real widow. There are those that are early writings from Philo and Ignatius who speak of widows who are virgins, suggesting that they were without a man, woman. Again, I'm just citing what some people say, not to say that I necessarily agree with that, but that there is information that some people would try to go in that direction. Then there are different kinds of widows. Are the widows in verse 9 and verses 3, 5, and 16 one and the same? Or was Paul referring to two types of widows, a real widow and an enrolled widow, or one that's been put on the list? So we have a widow indeed, separate from the one that is enrolled or the one that's added to the list. Or are they one and the same? Then there's the meaning of their first pledge, which is a really serious consideration when you're looking through this text. Try to make sense of the context. What in the world does that mean? The meaning of their first pledge. Some would say, well, is this the first wedding vow? Is this a vow that they took in order to be a part of some work, or that they would remain unmarried and dedicate their time and service to the church in order to be added to that support? Those are questions. Or, some people would even go as far as say this was a vow of commitment to celibacy. I wouldn't say that, but there are some that would say that. So when you look at some of the language that's used, for example, in verse 11 and verse 15, there's some pretty condemning language that is used here. For example, it talks about them basically being led away from Christ. It says, for when they have begun to wax wanton against Christ, and then in verse 15, they've already turned aside to Satan. What actions did Paul have in mind here? What exactly is it that a younger widow has done that has caused her to do that? Is it just because she hasn't met those qualifications? Is it because a younger widow has now married? Or is it that younger widow if it is stated that the older widows had made a pledge or vow or commitment that they would, in order to receive this support the rest of their life, then the rest of their life be in service to Christ. But yet the younger widows, he's saying they don't need to do that because they would get sexual desires potentially and want to marry. And if they have then made a pledge that they would not do that, then they would be violating that vow or pledge, and that then would cause the damnation or the incurring judgment, because then they have cast off their first, instead of faith, it would be their first pledge. That is the pledge that they made that they would do so. So there's the question here: what exactly is it that would cause a younger widow then to incur damnation or have damnation and then ultimately be turned aside to Satan in context of what's being talked about? And certainly it's not just because she didn't have these qualifications. That's then, okay, what did he have in mind here? There's a lot more, as people look at, the indictment that is against those younger women. It says here in verse 13 that they would ultimately be idle, wandering around, going house to house, speaking things they shouldn't be speaking, tattlers, busybodies, saying things they shouldn't be talking about. Some people would point to that and say, well, this is for those women that had made that pledge and had decided to be a part of that particular service for the kingdom, then that's what they were actually doing. They were going house to house and they were providing a service. Based upon the qualifications in verse 10, it would have had to have been part of, caring for individuals and providing compassion support for individuals according to verse 10 and some of the qualifications that are listed there. And so instead of actually being busy about that, then they would get involved in other things. So he says it's better for them to marry and be busy in the home that is mentioned there in verse 14. So what is the overall purpose? Why did Paul give this instruction about enrolling widows and qualifications? Did he provide here some requirements for selective charity? Was he talking about widows being enrolled into a particular service or ministry or work? Is there an overlap between the two? These are questions that come up as you move through this text. Is it possible he had more in mind than just food distribution, as was taking place in other places where there was service being done? There's a lot to try to pass through here when looking at this text. So then now let's go back and let's look at the text itself. Having defined a lot and gone through a lot of information, now let's go back to the text and let's look at it. Honor widows, 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 3, honor widows that are widows indeed, that is just truly those that are widows. If any widow have children or nephews or grandchildren, as other translations put that, let them first learn to show piety at home. And really, it's not just children nor grandchildren, it's their progeny. Is that the right word? Their generations. So it's their family. It could go further than that, but it's those that are related to them that go down in their family tree there. And so he says, if they have them, let them first learn to show piety, and that is honor, respect, reverence at home, and to requite, that is to pay back their parents, for that is good and acceptable before God. Good is a textual variant, not in some manuscripts in others, but acceptable before God. Verse 5, now she that is a widow indeed, so we know who we're talking about, one that is truly a widow, and then also desolate by herself. She doesn't have a spouse, doesn't have children, trusteth in God, and continueth in supplications and prayers night and day. But she that liveth in pleasure is dead while she liveth. So you have a contrast between a spiritual one, that is a widow, indeed, truly a widow, and then you have a contrast between one that is living in luxurious pleasure. We use the word prodigal for the prodigal son, and here it would be a similar word that is used here, at least a similar meaning of luxurious, pleasurous living, is already dead while she lives. And these things give in charge that they may be blameless. Okay, is he talking to the children that they need to take care of their family members? He's given charge to them that they may be blameless. Is he talking to the church that provides support for those that are widows indeed, that they may be blameless? Is he providing information to widows so that they don't decide to live in luxury and pleasure and sensuality, but rather that they dedicate their time in trusting God in prayers and supplication night and day? In verse 8, but if any provide not for his own, and especially for those of his own house, he denied the faith and is worse than an infidel. So if you provide not for your own, that is your own relatives, that's a broader category. And then specifically those of your own house, you've denied the faith and is worse than a pagan. At least that's kind of the idea, the infidel, an unbeliever. And that's a very, very serious charge for those that are Christians to provide that support and to be that lifeline for their family members. In verse 9, let not a widow be taken into the number. So we've been talking about widows that are truly widows. Now he just talks about a widow. And then one that is taken into the number, one that is enrolled, put on a list, under 60 years, under 60. Having been the wife of one man. So I think that would indicate fidelity and faithfulness. But you know, the spouse is gone. That's what causes this individual to be a widow. Well reported for good works. Some would say that, you know, because of the way that the sentence structure is laid out in verse 10, that here is an overview statement, well reported for good works, and then it just lists. It's almost as if when you have one that comes and says, I want to be an enrolled widow and I'm 60 or above, then they say, okay, you have then been faithful in your relationship and your marriage, and then also you've been noted. You have a reputation for good works, and by the way, let's talk about those good works. And they would almost list this like a resume or bullet points underneath those good works. She's brought up children, lodged strangers, that is hospitality. If she has washed the saints' feet, if she has relieved the afflicted or comforted and provided for those that were suffering, if she has diligently followed every good work. So you have qualifications for an individual that is going to be put on the list that is a widow. Fidelity, also, you know, someone that has been a good reputation for being an active Christian and involved in that, then can be one that is put on the list. But the younger widows then refuse. Why? For when they have begun to wax wanton against Christ, and there's lots of different translations that will carry that in a lot of different ways. Some would say that, you know, when they begin to have the natural tendencies of sexual desire, then they will want to marry, which makes most sense. Instead of the younger widows are just going to want to go out and, you know, get involved in things they shouldn't be getting involved in, then they will marry. It doesn't seem to follow in the context. It seems to follow more that when the natural desires arise, because they are younger, then they will marry. And then verse 12, having damnation, because they have cast off their first faith. And withal they learned to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but tattlers also, and busybodies, speaking things which they ought not. So here are those that are not to be put on a list. not to be enrolled, not to be cataloged, because they're young and they're under a certain age, then they're not to be put on that list because they still have sexual desires and will want to marry. For whatever reason, that's going to cause damnation for them because they've cast off their first pledge or their first faith. And on top of that, then there will be this additional idleness that would take place. And instead of having that idleness, which can cause trouble, in verse 14, I would therefore that the younger women marry, bear children, guide the house, that is, rule the house, give none occasion to the adversary to speak reproachfully, for some are already turned aside after Satan. So, they didn't turn aside after Satan just because they were younger and had sexual desires and decided to marry. So there has to be something more involved here that would cause them to have condemnation, that would cause them to have some of these things that are listed here and to be turned aside to Satan. And then verse 16, if any man or woman that believeth have widows, let them relieve them, and let not the church be charged. So if we have those in our family, as already been stated in verse 8, then we have to rise up and to take care of them, to relieve them, to provide, and I think I put up here, relieve is to aid, to do service, to render help. And so that is our role as Christians in our family, is to rise up and provide for those individuals and relieve them, and let not the church be charged, that it may relieve them that are widows indeed. And so if there are family members, then are they widows indeed? But they are truly widows. They're just not desolate widows. So that's why it gets complicated, because the true definition of widows indeed, even though we use it that way, is just a real widow. I mean, she's a real widow. I mean, if your family member becomes a widow and is a real widow, just not a desolate widow, from the standpoint of not having anybody to take care. And so, in that standpoint, but ultimately, what it's trying to say here is, when it talks about those widows that are widows indeed, it's speaking to those that are actually the desolate, that don't have anybody else to be able to fill in the gap and to take care of them. Okay, so that's a lot of information. So I'm curious to get your comments, or maybe your feedback, or maybe you can point to a particular verse, and we'll see how this goes.
I was going to point out 1 Corinthians 7, verse 8, has a difference between a widow and an unmarried female. They're both called out in that passage. I'm attacking the idea that widows are just unmarried persons.
Sure. I don't think that had reference to it, and I think that was definitely a stretch for someone to try to go there. But there have been references to that in early literature, so that's why that was referenced.
I think it's also important to consider the direction that the Catholic Church went,
Mm-hmm.
Nunnery, and how you can see the basis of a widow indeed that's on a list performing a job, and be someone that you would think would be a Catholic nun.
Right.
However, the trouble in the Catholic Church that's come because of these lustful desires these younger women had is exactly what he's condemning. Don't put a woman in this position. She's below the age of 60 and still has these passionate desires. But Donna, when she's serving in a position, she's got these lustful desires. Don't put her in this position. It's caused a bunch of problems for them while they're trying to piece together their idea set. Follow the idea set of a nunnery. Think of widow indeed, someone who's lost a husband, has been lost a husband, has no one to provide for her, that's given her a task, which is that she can put on the list. Take into the number in verse number 9. Under the age of 60 caused a lot of the problems. When you think about the sound of music, contrast.
I did not think of that, but yeah, thank you.
Go back to chapter 3, and it's something he's giving the prophet, in verse number 11, it speaks of their lives, and keep all of their lives.
Mm-hmm.
So, Diane Wood being I thought Mr. mentioned himself that he worked with lives there, and interpretation and not translation. Look at the word, it really makes a woman who could be married or unmarried.
Hmm.
And throughout one of the things a little bit odd, and this is right in the middle part of the sequence, but there is no mention of an elder's wife. He's have such called the only mention of Jesus. In Romans chapter 16, verse 1, Paul refers to Phoebe as servant. And the servant is the same document as Jesus. Female as word. Similarly, I guess in Acts 14, Barnabas is referred to as apostle.
Right.
We know that Barnabas is not apostle. But the word apostle is used in the broader sense to refer to him as a messenger or a speaker or things like that. So the argument that Brother Lewis made in all of the preemption is that similar to that, the deacon, the office of deacon was used in the broader sense of deacon as a service, not that he was a deacon in the sense of he held the office of a deacon. He was referred to a deacon in the broader sense of the apostle. He was saying that he was making a connection in chapter 3 with Paul taking mention of the wives, saying that that's meaning his opinion is that this is generally this is basically the first beginning of the care.
Right, for the enrolled. And the reason Thayer says that is because enrolled is like enlisted, and those in the military are enlisted. So that implies that you're enlisted for a task. And so Thayer describes that as, because that word is used as enlisted, then that implies that there was a job for them to do. And then he, I guess we'd say, surmises that it would be, the job would have been that they would have been over. Right. Well, the Bible talks about Christ being a diakonos. So, the word is used in a general sense, and then it's used as an office. Just in the same way than the exact context we're in, the presbyteros, which is elder, is reference to somebody's old. But as we come on down and talk about those that are worthy of double honor, then we're talking about the actual elder. So sometimes you have words that have multiple meanings. They have a more general meaning and then a very specific meaning. But there's no doubt that you've got the females here that have been added to a list and that have qualifications they have to meet in order to be added to that list. And then the younger ones were to be refused. They could not be a part of whatever that means to be put on the list. And the reason that people would jump down, especially in verse 12, is because of first faith. They would reference that as the pledge, which is the way the American Standard translates it. And so if they had made some pledge, then that would make sense that if they violated it to marry, that's how they would put this all together. Not to say that it's right or wrong. I'm just saying this is how they would come to this conclusion, is that they would go to verse 12. The American Standard says that they've cast off their first pledge. Well, then it makes sense if they had pledged that they were going to do this, but younger ones then would marry. That would cause them to violate a pledge that they said that they wouldn't do it, that they wouldn't marry. And then that would be breaking a vow or a pledge, which would cause damnation and then would cause other things. There is another explanation of this, and that is simply that these younger women would marry non-Christians. I don't think it seems to fit as well, but there is an explanation that I have read that states that these younger women then would wax wanton, have the sexual desires, and instead would marry outside of Christ, marry a pagan, and which would cause them to leave Christ, having damnation to cast off their actual first faith, and then ultimately to turn aside from Satan. Mm. Right, right. So yeah, it's well, if a sin unrepented of and continued in would. You wouldn't necessarily have to leave your faith in Christ. I didn't catch you, Roger. Yes, sir. Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah. Um, what's interesting, and of course I have a big old stack, and I was reading all these different references, and I listened to Curtis Cates explain it, and I've listened to Marvin Weir, and I've read Robert Taylor Jr., and several of these guys that are respected, and a majority of them would reference some particular list, that some service that they were rendering, in which they had been done. But it was interesting that Guy Woods was quoted by Marvin Weir to say that basically the church has an obligation to take care of widows, whether they're above 60 or below 60. And that was basically, we can't say, well, so-and-so is too young, the church can't help that person. No, we have an obligation to help. No matter the age, if somebody's desolate and they are in need, then we have to rise up to that. And so, yeah, right. Right. Sure. So, you guys marinate on all of that extra information, and then next time we'll come together, and if you've got any additional thoughts, we can bring those out, and then we'll continue to plow forward in our text and get to some really interesting and challenging things, like adding a little wine to your water for your stomach's sake, and things like that are coming in our context are always interesting discussions as well. So we'll move forward in our discussion. Was that the second bell? They came in. I was assuming it was. I thought them come in, but I thought, they just got in trouble. That's all. Thank you so much for your comments.